Hi everyone, welcome to my review of the Campfire Ponderosa, which is a very interesting IM. It's green. Of course, you don't have to get it in green if you don't like green, but just for your knowledge, green is very in 2024. Everything is turning out in sort of greener shades, especially in the luxury segment. I mean, you of course have the Rolex green, and a lot of watches are now making green variants. And this, of course, is not as new as 2024. This began sometime around the pandemic, right after. I mean, you had green watches and stuff from way before, but green is becoming in. I think Louis Vuitton is also working with green. So this is cool. I mean, I like green. And the reason why I went off on a segue to talk about green is because one of the things that immediately caught my attention about this IM is this green packaging. Also the fact that it's a very bare bones, environmentally friendly packaging. So kudos to Campfire for that. And it's still nicely done despite being minimal, right? It's a nice design. It's a nice aesthetic. It's a nice visual. And yeah, and this is green. You can, of course, get this in black if you are someone who's not as interested in the colorful presentation. This is, of course, a part of Campfire's chromatic lineup. This, out of the other chromatic lineup, chromatic IMs, somehow reminds me more of the Campfire Andromeda, and I assure you it's not because it's green. In many ways, it is an improvement to the original Andromeda, and I haven't had a lot of listening time to the latest one, and I do feel the latest one is a lot more punchy in the base, a lot more resolute in terms of its detail retrieval and all that. But this one, I think, is just a very nice and perhaps a nicer rendition of the OG. So I'll come to that. I'll talk about sound. So in this review, I'll talk about this of course. I'll do a bit of the unboxing. I will draw comparisons to its more expensive brethren like the Supermoon, which is the only planar in the chromatic series lineup. And this is an IM that I like a lot. I use a lot in the gym. And I'll talk about different sources that I've driven it with. So you see the Sony W1 ZM2 DAB. This is the Osprey, the PB5 from Ibasso Audio. This is a wonderful tube amp. And of course, this has Korg new tubes, not your classic tubes. And of course, then I will talk a bit about how it fares with its sort of a slightly less expensive counterpart. This is the single dynamic driver Cascara. So hopefully this review will be useful for you in deciding whether this one is for you. Okay, to jump right in and talk about the unboxing. I mean, honestly, I haven't really looked at this because I'm acquainted with this sort of unboxing experience, and it's awesome. In its sort of bare bonesism, its minimalism. You get this baggie, this mesh pouch, and you get a decent quality zipper. There's some padding here. And you get another mesh pouch for your, earphones or IMs, and you get a pocket here if you wanted to, let's say, carry the cable inside separately for whatever reason. Some people do, and it's a nice design. You, of course, get a plethora of tips, and this I really don't want to take off because I'm not into stock tips as much. I have a plethora of sort of high-end aftermarket tips that I used to tweak the sound with, but you get your share of foam tips and your silicone tips, and these are the foam tips that I think these IMs came with, and of course a cleaning cloth. The reason I don't want to open this, guys, is just because I somehow am yet to find a Campfire IM that I haven't liked more with aftermarket tips. That's just how it is. I'm a huge fan of Campfire, so I do want to disclaim that. I am a fan of Campfire. But of course, what you will hear are not biased towards Campfire, but I hope you'll hear what is objective, in terms of what this sounds like. Okay, so the unboxing is minimal. You got a cleaning cloth, you got a baggie. This, of course, is the bare bones package version. You get a more premium packaging if you want, with more leather goods, more leather accessories and leather bags and stuff. And that stuff is really, really cool, and I've seen it. But I mean, I'm fine with this. I'm about the IM. It's between being an expensive IM and not a very expensive IM. So it's around $800, which to me is like a nice sweet spot between, let's say, a mid-fi IM around $500 and above, right? So I would call this a mid-fi IM. It's not meant to be a flagship, Summit-fi, TOTL, call it what you will. Like, this is intended to be a Summit 5 flagship TOTL. This is, of course, the Fat Frequency Grand Maestro, and this obviously has a lot more drivers and a lot of interesting technologies, and you pay up the wazoo for this. This is, I think, a third of the price of the Fat Freak. And what happens when you buy something cheaper and something that has less tech. Of course, you get a better size often. I mean, this is phenomenal for its size. This fits really well. It isolates really well. Love it for that. I do want to talk about its specs, guys, because this can be sensitive to hiss. So this, I think, is 94 dB SPL, which is not the deal breaker. I mean, nothing is a deal breaker, of course, but this has 6 ohm impedance, which is interesting. It hasn't been a problem for me driving it even with the Sony biamped with the Ibasso. The Sony itself is not very powerful, as some of you might know. A lot of you, as a matter of fact, have shied away from the Sony because it's not very powerful. Because it cannot drive Subtonic Storm, for example, or an Elysian Annihilator 2023, for example. It can. I mean, let me just rephrase that. That's a perception. I mean, if I drove if I drove an Annie, I'm just stuttering a bit, or if I drove a Subtonic Storm, I wouldn't sell my Sony. I mean, I understand why some people might, or some people might avoid it, because I've tried the Subtonic Storm with the Sony, and it sounds better despite having low power. Because Subtonic Storm to me sounds dry and clinical of a lot of the more regular Delta Sigma jabs. Of the Sony, the Subtonic Storm sounds more holistic, sounds slightly richer and all that, right? So I still like the Subtonic Storm of the Sony, even though I have to crank the volume up to perhaps 90% of what this is capable. But I digress, as usual. The Sony is not very powerful, so I don't get a hiss with the Sony whatsoever. No hiss. However, I don't even get a hiss when I've maxed out the volume of the Sony and I'm using it with the PB5, which doesn't have which has decent volume increments, but I mean, the PB5 can drive a high-frequency Aria with the Sony, right? So the PB5 does offer a solid 1.7 watt of power, so it's powerful for an IM, but I still get no hiss. So it's not like you have to worry about hiss, but I think it's just worth mentioning. Like, you couldn't drive this off an OTL, off a tube amp. You'd get a bizarre effect in terms of how its FR would get perhaps elevated in the bass, and you'd get a lot of noise and all that, right? If you drove it with a desktop source, like, I don't know, a benchmark or something, then of course I think you'd pick up hiss. But for every modern day jab that I've tried this with, even the Ibasso, which is a DX260 that I have here that I also like, I own this, I use it in the gym. It's a lovely dab that should get a review of its own. I really like how light this is, how powerful this is, and this is a bright signature. So I'll talk about how this pairs with this. In general, guys, it is somewhat sensitive to hiss, but not with your modern day DAPs. So that's worth keeping in mind. Now, in terms of the sound, I would describe this as slightly more Harmonish, but better than Harman. I mean, what Harman tries to do is the Harman Graph or Harman Tune IMs try to be generalists, so that they try to cater to everyone, and they try to cater to every genre, which is my issue with it, because people then think it's a target. But of course, it's not a specialist IM if something is Harman tuned. So what often happens to people who are more experienced with high-end gear, and people who are more experienced and have slightly more developed palettes, and I strongly believe in this, that if you hear a lot of high-end stuff day in, day out, if you own them and live with them, your palette changes. It happened to me, so I know I'm sort of a historical censor for this. I sense this happening with me. Now, what happens with Harman is that it becomes boring. So people walk away from Harman, and that includes myself, that includes a lot of more experienced audiophiles on the water cooler thread on HeadFi. However, how I think this beats Harman, and I haven't seen an FR graph for this, I haven't measured it, and I haven't seen anything online, but this is better than Harman in the sense that I do perceive that this has a little more mid-bass than Harman, which I think renders the presentation smoother and fuller and warmer and thicker, because the Harman presentation can lack a bit of mid-bass and sound lean and honestly speaking, sound a bit weak because of that. And I mean, weak in the bass. Because the sub-bass itself, I think, comes through with Harman tuned graphs, but not mid-bass. And I do think that offsets the balance of the bass. With this, you will get more mid-bass. That's how I hear it. And that, of course, has the effect of making the mid-range warmer and smoother and more organic, which it does, and it just sounds more natural because of that. And I think, secondly, you do get a little more lower treble here than I think you get with Harman, because I do get a lot of clarity with female vocals. Overall, the headphone or the IM is tuned to be somewhat, intimate in your upper mids. A lot of people have talked about how its staging is not wide, but I beg to differ, because I got good staging on this, guys. Maybe it's the tips, I'm not sure. It's certainly the sources, because the Sony does throw a very wide stage, perhaps the widest, and it's maintained by the PB5 Osprey, and this also has a decent stage for its price point. This is around the $1,000 DAP, a little less if I'm not mistaken. So this, to me, is a better, more interesting rendition of Harman, a slightly more natural rendition of Harman that plays really well with almost everything still. So you get the best qualities of Harman, which is the fact that this is a generalist, and you are still able to get more warmth than I think you would get with something like a usual Harman tuned affair, like from T Audio or whatever. And you get a little more treble presence, which I think works really well with female vocals. So overall, the bass here is, it's a 5 BA affair. So the bass here is, I mean, it's BA bass, but if you get a good seal, and especially with these, so I'm using these final tips, not just because I think purple and this shade of green are a wonderful aesthetic, complement, but also because the final tips have an effect of making the bass weightier. And it sounds more dynamic driver like. As a matter of fact, this bass is a very decent bass. I've played rock and metal with this and I liked it. So the bass here is very well balanced between sub bass and mid bass. It's textured. It's very, very resolute and resolving. You get a lot of micro details even in the bass, whether it's from the bass guitar or whether it's from the kick drum. Moving on to the mid range. The mid range is nice, warm, smooth. A lot of it reminds me of the Andromedas, and it's lovely. So if you like this sort of mid range, you would like this a lot. There is pinna gain, so it's a very intimate presentation, but it's not so intimate that it becomes shouty. Treble is nicely done. It's warm, I think, overall, but it's not rolled off. But you don't get treble tizziness either. So overall, it's a warm sounding set, but you do get some clarity, and you get female vocals coming through very nicely. So that's how I would put the tonality. And to talk about technical performance, I want to sort of draw comparisons, but I think, because just to say it's resolving and it's not super wide but kind of wide, it images really well, which it really does, and has good timbre is not enough. So I think it makes sense to do some comparisons. So what the Cascara does, it has a dynamic driver timbre in the bass. So I prefer that, honestly, for the bass. So that's worth keeping in mind. I'm a huge enthusiast when it comes to sort of nitpicking how bass sounds. So it's the qualitative aspect of it, not so much the quantitative aspect of it, although I do think some bass quantity is important for me to enjoy my music. The Cascara is phenomenal for bass. It is an incredible IM for bass, a single dynamic driver, perhaps one of the best I've ever heard, despite the fact that it's not very expensive. And this will be getting its own review. The Cascara I would pick over the Ponderosa for bass quality, for bass timbre. However, I do think that overall what a 5 BA IM can do, such as this can do, is give you a little more resolution, a little more, imaging clarity and all that compared to the Cascara. So it does sound more technical, and that does matter to listening pleasure, because once you've heard all this information, whether it's imaging related information or just getting more nuances from the track, it's difficult to go to an IM that doesn't do what this can do. So that's worth keeping in mind. And then, of course, you have something like the Supermoon, which is, of course, a different level of an IM from Campfire, although it's not significantly more expensive. I just think this is a very different IM from most things, because I do think this is an IM that I think can compare and trade blows with IMs in the $3,000 price range, because it's very resolving. It has a planar bass, speed and impact, and it just sounds very liquid all through the FR. And then it has some treble presence, which I'm able to control with my Eletech Baroque tips. This cable also helps. Overall, I love this. So you do get more resolution with this. You do get more speed with this, and you do get more stage with this. But the staging here is not bad. People have talked about how it's not very wide, and I've already covered it. I think it's wide enough. Imaging, people have talked about, and I do want to drive this point home. The imaging here is masterclass. The imaging surprised me. It's something to do with how I think the 5BA drivers come together, that this imaging just works really well. I do get the sense of images being out of the head a lot of the times, which is a bit of a trite, cliched expression, I know, but it just occurred to me when listening to this. I'm sharing it. That expression came to my mind. I was like, wait, their images somewhat out of my head, and this clearly does imaging better than your average, even sort of high-end IM. So that's worth keeping in mind. Now, in terms of dynamics and bass impact, of course, the Cascara has a lot more, dynamic driver impact. But somehow I think the Ponderosa still does bass impact well. I mean, it's elevated, especially with the final tips and maybe with my setup here. I didn't really miss DD bass, although I could tell it's not DD bass, if you know what I mean. It's fine line. Maybe if I hadn't known if it wasn't DD bass, I wouldn't have called it out. But I do think that if it came to impact and pure impact, I would take the Cascara, guys. Okay, so what that leaves us with a discussion on, let's say, timbre. And timbrely, I think IMs can be all over the place. So this one, I think, is a magnificent IM that I'm going to keep, that I bought with my own money. And I think the timbre here is great, but it can be sometimes a bit off depending on what configuration you have the vocal switch in. And timbre can be a bit, so this is awesome. Like I said, one of my favorite IMs of all time. I don't think I'll ever sell this. And IM here I do get a sense of a planar timbre, right? But it doesn't bother me. I mean, I'm a timbre head, but I can still appreciate different kinds of timbre presentations. This doesn't really have a BS smearishness or, a BS sort of plasticiness. It's almost timbre-less, and I really like that about Campfire BA IMs. Like, it's difficult to make out what they are, the driver type, and it just sounds smooth and cohesive and well put together. And for that, I really give it a high mark for timbre. So, who is all this for? I mean, does it make sense to own this if you own the Cascara, or does it make sense to own any of this? I mean, and just to answer that, guys, if I was listening to a lot of rock and metal and hip hop, I would probably get the Cascara. Because it's still more impactful, and it's got the dynamic driver bass, and it sounds a little, more deep in its transients and all that, right? Of course, if I could afford the Supermoon, I would get a Supermoon, and I wouldn't honestly get either of these two, because Supermoon is a different class of an IM. However, if you are somewhat sensitive to air frequencies and you don't want to get into that sort of treble region, and if you want to avoid that sort of treble region, the Ponderosa could actually be a good complement or a good alternative, because while it's not as resolving as a Supermoon, it's still very resolving. And if you want a warmer presentation, a little more a smoother and richer presentation, this is perhaps a very nice alternative. Like, I prefer this, but you might. And finally, if you like jazz, classical, and all those really cool, highbrow audiophile genres, then this is perhaps very interesting, because, I mean, you get a lot of vocal nuance and clarity coming through from female vocals, male vocals. Strings sound weighty and just very distinct and very, very articulate. And woodwind instruments sound magnificent. Brass sounds good. So it's a wonderful IM overall for audiophile genres. Like, I don't know if I'd listen to rock and metal with this, although I could. So that's the beauty of this. But if you're into all of that, the same stuff the Andromeda OG, the Andromeda 2019 or 2022 were good at, this is good at, with better, more rounded bass. So that's how I would put it, guys. This is an Andromeda with perhaps slightly less air frequencies and more rounded bass. This is just on listening impressions. I haven't heard the FR, of course. I haven't seen the FR, of course. It's very difficult to hear the FR. But yeah, so that's it for me, guys. The Ponderosa is a very interesting IM. It's very interestingly named. It's pretty. It fits well. It isolates well. It looks nice with these purple final ear tips. I do recommend the final ear tips if you want to add more weightiness to the bass. The fit does make the bass sound more dynamic. Driver-like, if it goes all the way through, you get a better seal, and you get the last bit of notes that I replay impact. It does have elevated bass, so you do get a nice amount of bass coming through. Mid-range is lush and natural. Treble has some presence around lower treble to give it definition, incisiveness, and clarity to female vocals, as well as the entire presentation. And it doesn't have a whole lot of excess air frequencies, so it's overall, I think, a slightly warm tuned presentation. Can't pick up noise of desktop sources, but works very well with everything else. A great buy, I think, at this nice price point of $800. Not as technical as Supermoon, more technical than the Cascara. And overall, I think, given Campfire's fan base and growing fan base, I might add, I would say this is a home run, guys. So that's it from me, guys. I hope this review was useful, and stay tuned for my next one. Bye-bye.